Tonight, we begin with something as extraordinary as it is ominous for European security. The United Kingdom and Norway have just launched the largest coordinated anti-submarine warfare operation in the North Atlantic since the end of the Cold War. 37 warships, 12 submarines, and dozens of maritime patrol aircraft are hunting for Russian submarines detected, operating near critical undersea cables and energy infrastructure. The operation spans over 500,000 square kilometers of ocean. NATO allies are treating this not as a routine patrol, but as an active hunt for hostile forces threatening Europe's lifelines. Think about that. For nearly 3 years, Russia has conducted increasingly aggressive submarine operations in waters surrounding Europe, probing defenses, mapping infrastructure, demonstrating capability to strike at the arteries that keep Western economies functioning. But this time, rather than monitoring from a distance, the UK and Norway have mobilized forces at a scale that makes clear they're not just watching anymore, they're hunting. The message to Russia is unambiguous. We know you're there, we're coming for you, and your submarines will be found, tracked, and if necessary, neutralized. This is not about peacetime naval exercises. It's about protecting infrastructure that modern civilization cannot function without. The UK and Norway have effectively said, your submarines threaten our cables, our pipelines, our economic survival. We will find them and force them to surface or leave. That's not just a defensive statement. That's active warfare beneath the waves, a battle for control of ocean spaces that determines whether Europe can communicate, trade, and power itself. And that transformation may represent the most dangerous escalation in submarine warfare since Soviet boomers prowled these same waters during the Cold War. For over a century, submarine warfare has represented the most lethal and mysterious dimension of naval combat, where vessels worth billions hunt each other in three-dimensional darkness, using sensors that detect sounds kilometers away. World War I saw the first widespread submarine campaigns, German U-boats, sinking merchant shipping, and nearly starving Britain into submission before convoy systems and depth charges turned the tide. The threat was so severe that Winston Churchill later wrote that U-boats represented the only weapon that truly frightened him during the entire war. World War II elevated submarine warfare to industrial scale with innovations and tactics that changed naval combat forever. German U-boats, operating in wolf packs, sank over 3,000 Allied ships, totaling 14 million tons of vital cargo, killing tens of thousands of merchant sailors in freezing Atlantic waters far from rescue. The threat was so severe that Britain came perilously close to starvation in 1942 and 1943 as U-boats destroyed supply convoys faster than Allied shipyards could replace the losses, creating a crisis that nearly forced British surrender regardless of land combat outcomes. The Battle of the Atlantic consumed enormous resources on both sides in what became a technological and tactical arms race, spanning 6 years of continuous combat. Allied forces eventually developed sophisticated detection systems, including active sonar that could locate submerged U-boats, shipboard radar that could detect surfaced submarines at night, and code breaking through ultra-intelligence that allowed convoy routing around known U-boat patrol areas. British and American scientists worked frantically to develop improved depth charges, ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog that increased kill probability, and escort carriers that provided air cover across the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. But the cost was staggering in human terms and strategic resources. Over 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died in sinkings, often drowning in oil-covered water or dying from exposure before rescue arrived. The Royal Navy lost 783 warships to U-boat torpedoes. Germany lost 783 U-boats with their crews, representing over 28,000 submariners killed, the highest casualty rate of any German military branch. The battle demonstrated that submarine warfare, while potentially decisive, required enormous investment from both attackers and defenders, with victory going to whichever side could sustain operations longest. The Cold War transformed submarine warfare from commerce raiding and convoy attacks into nuclear deterrence and strategic reconnaissance that shaped superpower competition. Soviet submarines, armed with ballistic missiles carrying multiple nuclear warheads, prowled beneath the Arctic ice and in bastions off the Kola Peninsula, maintaining continuous deterrence through their near invulnerability to first strikes. American and British attack submarines tracked Soviet boomers continuously in operations so secret that crew members couldn't tell their families where they'd been or what they'd done, even decades after retirement. Ready to destroy enemy missile submarines if nuclear war began, and presidential orders authorized strikes. Both sides invested tens of billions of dollars in quieter submarines and more sensitive detection systems, creating an underwater technological arms race where incremental improvements in acoustic stealth or sonar sensitivity could shift the strategic balance between offensive and defensive forces. Soviet submarine designers prioritized speed and dive depth, creating titanium-hulled boats that could outrun NATO torpedoes and dive below crushed depths of American weapons. Western navies emphasized acoustic quietness and sensor capability, building submarines so silent that Soviet forces struggled to detect them, and equipping them with towed arrays that could hear enemy boats at extreme ranges under favorable oceanographic conditions. The Soviet Union stationed massive submarine forces in the Barents Sea and North Atlantic during the 1,980 seconds, creating existential threats to NATO reinforcement convoys that would have been critical if war had erupted in Europe and American divisions needed to cross the Atlantic. NATO response included deploying hunter-killer submarines specifically designed to track and destroy Soviet boats, maintaining standing anti-submarine warfare forces that practiced continuously in exercises simulating wartime operations. Veterans of those patrols described the psychological intensity of knowing that enemy submarines might be just kilometers away, listening through the same water column, waiting for any acoustic signature that would reveal your position and allow them to launch weapons that travel hundreds of knots underwater and cannot be outrun once fired. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, submarine operations in the North Atlantic declined dramatically as Russian naval forces rusted in port for lack of maintenance funding. The vast submarine fleets that once threatened NATO shipping routes were mothballed or scrapped. The underwater threat that had consumed NATO attention and resources for decades seemed to vanish almost overnight as Russian naval power collapsed along with the Soviet state. But Putin's Russia has systematically rebuilt submarine forces over the past decade, investing heavily in new designs that incorporate stealth technologies and capabilities that NATO submarine forces must constantly adapt to counter. The Yasin-class attack submarines represent generational improvement over Soviet-era boats, with acoustic signatures so quiet that Western navies struggle to detect them at operationally useful ranges. The Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines can operate almost silently while running on batteries, making them extraordinarily difficult to locate in coastal waters, where background noise from shipping and geology masks their presence. When Russian submarines began probing near critical European infrastructure starting in 2022, NATO initially treated these operations as reconnaissance or intimidation rather than immediate threats requiring aggressive response. Submarines were detected near undersea communication cables linking Europe to North America, cables carrying data traffic that represents trillions of dollars in financial transactions and communications, critical to government and commercial operations. They were found near energy pipelines, bringing Norwegian natural gas to European consumers, pipelines that became critically important after Russia cut off gas supplies through land-based routes. Western intelligence agencies documented Russian submarine activity through multiple detection systems, including underwater listening arrays, satellite surveillance of submarine bases, and intercepted communications discussing operations near infrastructure that Russian military planners clearly understood were vulnerable targets. The pattern suggested not random patrols but systematic mapping of European vulnerabilities. identifying exactly where to strike if Russia decided to escalate beyond Ukraine. The UK and Norway, both heavily dependent on undersea infrastructure and both possessing sophisticated anti-submarine warfare capabilities, watched these Russian operations with increasing alarm as the pattern became impossible to dismiss as routine naval activities. British officials recognized that severing transatlantic data cables would create communications chaos affecting financial markets, government operations, and civilian internet access. Norwegian authorities understood that pipeline sabotage would devastate European energy security during winter, when natural gas demand peaks and alternatives are limited. The decision to launch this massive submarine hunt represents a fundamental shift from passive monitoring to active interdiction. Rather than simply tracking Russian submarines and documenting their movements, the UK and Norway have mobilized forces to locate every Russian boat in a vast swath of ocean and force them either to surface, leave the area, or face increasingly aggressive prosecution that could escalate to weapons deployment if Russian submarines refuse to comply with demands to depart. Think about that. NATO allies are conducting offensive anti-submarine operations against Russian forces in international waters, using detection systems and tactics designed to strip away the stealth that makes submarines effective. This isn't peacetime naval diplomacy. This is active hunting with rules of engagement that almost certainly authorize weapons use if Russian submarines are deemed to threaten critical infrastructure or refuse to surface when detected and challenged. The scale of the operation is staggering and reveals how seriously the UK and Norway are taking this submarine threat to European security. 37 surface warships from both navies, plus allied contributions from other NATO members, each equipped with towed sonar arrays that can detect submarines at ranges exceeding 50 kilometers under favorable oceanographic conditions, when thermoclines and salinity layers don't interfere with acoustic propagation. 12 hunter-killer submarines deploying their own sophisticated passive and active sonar systems to locate Russian boats that surface ships might miss, using tactics developed over decades of anti-submarine warfare training and refined through countless exercises against friendly submarines, simulating enemy tactics. Maritime patrol aircraft, including American P-8 Poseidons and British RC-135 reconnaissance planes, equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors that can sense the distinctive magnetic signature of submarine hulls passing beneath ocean surface, even at depths exceeding 200 meters, dropping patterns of sonobuoys that create temporary listening networks across hundreds of square kilometers of ocean, processing acoustic data through onboard computers that can distinguish submarine signatures from whales, shipping traffic, and geological noise that pervades the underwater environment. These aircraft can remain airborne for 12 hours or more, allowing continuous coverage of patrol areas where Russian submarines might attempt to transit or loiter near infrastructure targets. The operation requires extraordinary coordination between forces from different nations using different equipment, procedures, and command structures that must mesh seamlessly for effective submarine detection. British Type 23 frigates, working alongside Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen-class frigates, sharing sonar data through secure NATO networks that fuse and process information from multiple sensors into coherent tactical pictures of underwater activity that are updated in real time. American P-8 aircraft, providing critical support through their advanced sensors and long endurance, making them invaluable for covering the vast ocean areas where Russian submarines might hide in deep water or beneath thermal placidus layers. The technological integration alone represents years of NATO interoperability training and investment now being applied in operations that increasingly resemble actual combat rather than peacetime exercises or routine patrols. Russian submarines face impossible tactical dilemmas in this saturated operational environment that offers no good options. If they remain submerged and try to evade detection through slow speeds and minimal maneuvering, They risk being located anyway by the comprehensive sensor networks saturating their operating areas through passive listening that can detect even the quietest modern submarines, potentially being tracked continuously until they exhaust battery power on diesel-electric boats, or generate acoustic signatures from essential ship systems that give away their positions, forcing them to surface in humiliating circumstances. If they surface voluntarily and attempt to transit out of the area on the surface or at snorkel depth, they admit to NATO forces exactly where they were operating and what infrastructure they were surveying, providing invaluable intelligence that will shape future defensive operations and revealing capabilities that Russia would prefer to keep secret. If they refuse to leave and continue their infrastructure reconnaissance and mapping missions despite NATO pressure, they risk dramatic escalation, where weapons might be deployed if NATO commanders determine based on intelligence and tactical positioning that Russian intent clearly justifies preventive action to protect critical systems that European economic survival depends upon daily. And yet, here's the uncomfortable truth for Russian naval planners trying to develop effective responses. They cannot accomplish their reconnaissance and intimidation missions successfully if NATO forces make submarine operations in these critical waters unsustainably risky through persistent hunting. The entire strategic value of submarine operations depends fundamentally on stealth, on being able to approach high-value targets completely undetected, on creating strategic uncertainty about where Russian boats might be operating at any given time throughout vast ocean areas. When NATO saturates an area with sensors and hunting forces, that stealth advantage disappears and submarines become vulnerable to detection and tracking that renders them ineffective for the missions they were designed to accomplish. This is where the strategic calculus completely shifts against Russian submarine operations. Because modern anti-submarine warfare favors the defender when detection systems can be deployed in sufficient density across areas that submarines must transit. A single submarine trying to evade 12 hunter-killer boats and dozens of maritime patrol aircraft faces odds that make mission success unlikely and submarine survival questionable if NATO forces decide to escalate from tracking to engagement. There's a misconception in some analysis that submarine operations remain as viable today as they were during the Cold War, when Soviet boats could hide in vast ocean spaces that NATO lacked sensors to monitor comprehensively. But modern detection systems have tilted the balance toward anti-submarine forces in many operational environments, particularly in relatively constrained waters near Europe, where geography limits submarine maneuver options, and NATO can concentrate sensors. From the outside, the North Atlantic may look like an enormous space where submarines can easily hide from detection. But if you understand how sonar works and how modern sensor networks are deployed, you recognize that NATO can create detection barriers across key transit routes that Russian submarines must cross to reach their target areas or return to bases. Those barriers, once established with sufficient sensor density, make submarine operations extraordinarily risky because detection probability approaches certainty when boats must transit through monitored choke points. When British and Norwegian naval officials briefed their governments on the operational plan, they emphasized that this hunt would demonstrate NATO capability to locate and track Russian submarines, even in their most advanced boats, using latest stealth technologies. The operation serves multiple purposes: protecting critical infrastructure from immediate threats, collecting intelligence on Russian submarine capabilities and tactics, and sending unmistakable signals that NATO will not tolerate aggressive submarine operations near European economic lifelines. Here's the first hook. What makes this so extraordinary is not just the immediate tactical situation of hunting specific Russian submarines, but the strategic message it sends about NATO resolve and capability. Russia cannot conduct submarine intimidation campaigns if NATO demonstrates willingness and ability to hunt those submarines aggressively, strip away their stealth, and force them to surface or leave operational areas. The asymmetric advantage Russia sought through submarine operations evaporates when faced with determined anti-submarine response at this scale. The genius of this operation lies in its sustainability and its demonstration effects. Unlike brief surge operations that temporarily increase naval presence, this hunt can be sustained for weeks or months if necessary, using forces that UK and Norway can maintain without exhausting their naval capabilities. Every day, the operation continues. Russian submarine commanders must decide whether to remain in area facing increasing detection probability or withdraw and abandon their infrastructure reconnaissance missions. Military strategists studying this operation recognize its significance for deterring future Russian submarine provocations. When submarine operations become this risky and this likely to result in detection and tracking, the military value of those operations declines below the threshold where commanders will authorize them. Submarines are too expensive and too valuable to risk in operations that are likely to fail and potentially result in loss of the boat and its crew. What's truly remarkable about this hunt is how it exploits every advantage that modern technology provides to anti-submarine forces. Networked sensors share data instantaneously, allowing fusion of information from multiple platforms that creates detection capability far exceeding what any single ship or aircraft could achieve alone. Satellite communications allow real-time coordination across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. Processing algorithms sort through vast amounts of acoustic data to identify submarine signatures amid background noise that would overwhelm human operators. For months, the implications have been building. Russian submarine activity near critical infrastructure increasing in frequency and boldness. NATO intelligence documenting these operations without taking aggressive action to stop them. European officials growing increasingly concerned that passive monitoring was insufficient deterrent to prevent eventual sabotage that could devastate communications or energy supplies. The pressure for more assertive response building until political leaders authorize this unprecedented submarine hunt. But here's the truth that Russian naval commanders must now confront. NATO anti-submarine capabilities have advanced to the point where submarine operations in defended waters carry prohibitive risks. The technological balance has shifted from the Cold War era, when Soviet submarines could operate with reasonable confidence of avoiding detection. Modern sensors, networked operations, and sophisticated processing have made submarine operations near Europe far more dangerous than Russian planners apparently anticipated. Let's be clear about what this operation demonstrates. NATO allies working together can saturate ocean areas with sensors and hunting forces at density that makes submarine operations untenable. British and Norwegian naval forces, coordinating through NATO command structures, can find Russian submarines even in their quietest boats and track them continuously once detected. The capability gap that Russia hoped to exploit through advanced submarine designs has been neutralized through superior NATO sensor networks and operational coordination. Allied naval forces have documented this operation through multiple classified intelligence channels and some controlled releases to demonstrate capability without revealing specific technical details that would compromise future operations. Submarine detections confirmed through multiple independent sensors. Tracking solutions maintained for hours or days, proving NATO forces can follow Russian boats continuously once initial contact is established. Communications intercepts showing Russian submarine commanders reporting their detection and requesting instructions from headquarters uncertain how to proceed. Think about that. Russian submarines, designed to operate covertly near enemy infrastructure, are being found, tracked, and essentially neutralized as effective threats because NATO forces can locate them and maintain contact. The stealth that makes submarines valuable is being stripped away through sensor saturation that Russian submarine quieting technology cannot overcome. Here's the second hook. You cannot conduct effective submarine operations when the enemy can find your boats and track them continuously. You cannot intimidate adversaries through submarine presence when those adversaries can demonstrate they know exactly where your submarines are at all times. Every Russian submarine forced to surface or withdraw represents a strategic defeat that undermines the entire concept of using submarine operations to threaten European infrastructure. The broader implications extend beyond this specific operation to fundamental questions about submarine warfare in modern contested environments. If NATO can hunt Russian submarines this effectively in the North Atlantic, similar operations could be mounted anywhere. Russia attempts submarine intimidation. The Black Sea, Baltic approaches, Mediterranean waters, all could be saturated with NATO sensors that make Russian submarine operations prohibitively risky if alliance members decide to respond aggressively to perceived threats. And now comes the bitter irony that history provides. During the Cold War, Soviet submarines threatened NATO sea lanes, and alliance strategists invested enormously in anti-submarine capabilities to counter that threat. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many of those capabilities atrophied as budgets declined and focus shifted to other priorities. But Russian submarine resurgence has forced NATO to rebuild and modernize anti-submarine forces, creating capabilities that now surpass Cold War levels in many respects through integration of technologies that didn't exist in the 1980 seconds. International maritime security analysts watching this operation recognize its significance for global naval balance. When major powers demonstrate ability to locate and track enemy submarines in contested waters, it changes calculations about submarine utility for coercion and intimidation. Russia cannot credibly threaten European infrastructure through submarine operations if NATO proves capable of finding those submarines and forcing them to withdraw or surface. There's something profoundly revealing about NATO allies mounting this operation now, rather than waiting for actual sabotage to occur. The proactive posture suggests intelligence indicating Russian submarine operations have moved beyond reconnaissance toward preparation for potential strikes, that waiting for actual attacks would be too late to prevent infrastructure damage with cascading economic consequences. Better to hunt the submarines now, demonstrate NATO capability and resolve, and deter strikes through visible readiness to defend critical systems. In the theater of undersea warfare, this represents a decisive shift from passive monitoring to active defense that may mark a new phase in European security. The image of 37 NATO warships hunting Russian submarines sends unmistakable messages about alliance capability and willingness to defend infrastructure that economic survival depends upon. A maritime domain that Russia thought it could operate in with relative impunity has become a hunting ground where Russian submarines are prey rather than predators. Here's the third hook. Sometimes in modern naval warfare, the greatest victories come not from sinking enemy vessels, but from stripping away the advantages that make those vessels effective. NATO's submarine hunt represents more than defensive reaction. It represents systematic negation of Russian submarine capabilities through sensors and tactics that make stealth impossible and submarine operations unsustainable in defended waters. The operational implications compound over time. Every day Russian submarines spend evading NATO hunters is a day they cannot accomplish their infrastructure reconnaissance missions. Every course change to avoid detection takes them further from their intended targets. Every time they must go deep or slow to reduce acoustic signature, they consume battery power or fuel that limits operational endurance. The cumulative effect degrades Russian submarine effectiveness far more thoroughly than direct combat engagement could achieve. Russian submarine commanders face psychological pressures that compound tactical challenges. Operating under continuous threat of detection creates stress that degrades decision-making and increases mistakes. Knowing that NATO forces are actively hunting your submarine rather than passively monitoring changes the entire operational calculus from stealth reconnaissance to survival evasion. The mental burden of operating in hostile waters saturated with enemy sensors cannot be sustained indefinitely without exhausting crews. And yet, what makes this moment even more remarkable is how it demonstrates NATO cohesion and capability at a time when Russia has consistently predicted alliance fractures and weakness. The UK and Norway coordinating this massive operation, supported by other NATO members, proves that alliance mechanisms for collective defense remain functional and effective despite Russian efforts to divide and weaken Western resolve. Something deeper than submarine hunting is unfolding across the North Atlantic, something that cannot be measured solely in submarines detected or operational areas denied. It's a fundamental reassertion of NATO control over maritime domains, critical to European security, a demonstration that alliance members will defend infrastructure collectively rather than waiting for individual nations to respond to attacks on their specific systems. For the first time since the Cold War ended, Russian submarines face anti-submarine warfare operations at scale that makes their presence near European infrastructure operationally untenable. NATO forces have achieved what military strategists call sea control in areas previously considered open to Russian submarine operations. The shift from Russian freedom of action to NATO-imposed restrictions on submarine movements represents strategic defeat for Russian naval intimidation campaigns. Western naval observers feel this shift in their assessments of Baltic and North Atlantic security. When NATO demonstrates capability and will to hunt Russian submarines aggressively, it changes assumptions about what Russia can accomplish through naval forces in contested waters. Analysts who worried about European vulnerability to submarine threats now recognize that coordinated Allied response can neutralize those threats through persistent anti-submarine operations. Here's the fourth hook. When your submarines cannot operate safely in waters you need to access, when your stealth advantage disappears under enemy sensor saturation, when your options reduce to withdrawal or surface under humiliating circumstances, you have lost control of a strategic domain that submarine operations are supposed to dominate. Russia cannot threaten European infrastructure through submarines that NATO can find and track continuously. The lesson is as old as naval warfare itself, but newly demonstrated through this North Atlantic operation. Control of maritime domains requires not just possessing capable forces, but being able to operate them effectively against determined opposition. Russian submarines, advanced as they may be in design and quieting technology, cannot overcome NATO sensor networks deployed at sufficient density across waters that European security depends upon. This hunt, unprecedented in scale since the Cold War, has exposed something profound about the limits of submarine warfare in modern contested environments. UK and Norway, coordinating through NATO structures, have demonstrated that alliance members can defend critical infrastructure through proactive operations that deny enemy submarines the freedom of action they need to threaten those systems. And that's what makes this development so powerful beyond its immediate operational impact. Because at its core, this isn't really about specific Russian submarines or particular undersea cables. It's about the fundamental question of whether NATO will defend European infrastructure proactively or wait for attacks that could devastate communications and energy supplies. The UK and Norway's answer, delivered through the largest submarine hunt since the Cold War, is that they will hunt Russian submarines before those boats can threaten systems European civilization depends upon. NATO's submarine hunt sends a message echoing far beyond the North Atlantic. Maritime domains are defensible when allies coordinate effectively. Submarine stealth can be overcome through sensor networks and persistent operations. Russian naval intimidation will be met with aggressive Allied response that makes submarine operations prohibitively risky in waters NATO is determined to defend. So tonight, as 37 warships and 12 submarines hunt Russian boats across 500,000 square kilometers of ocean, as maritime patrol aircraft drop sonobuoys, creating detection networks that strip away submarine stealth, as NATO demonstrates both capability and resolve to defend infrastructure that European security depends upon, perhaps there's a lesson worth stating clearly. You can build advanced submarines and deploy them near enemy infrastructure, but you cannot operate them effectively when NATO saturates those waters with sensors and hunting forces determined to find and track your boats. You can attempt to intimidate through submarine presence and implied threats to critical systems, but you cannot maintain that intimidation when Allied forces demonstrate they can locate your submarines and force them to surface or withdraw. And you can continue sending submarines into defended waters, insisting through propaganda that Russian naval power remains formidable and NATO forces remain unprepared, but you cannot hide the reality that your boats are being hunted systematically by Allied forces whose anti-submarine capabilities have advanced beyond what Russian quieting technology can overcome in waters where NATO has decided to establish and maintain sea control. I'm Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.